Barbara and Kaz, whenever you guys are ready, I can read the talking points and we can get going. But
sure. Do you want to get started?
Yeah, whenever you're ready.
Kaz, do you think we should wait another minute or two? What do you think? Is there anybody signing in?
Let me check. It looks like most of the people who've signed up are in.
Okay.
Okay.
Great. So why don't you get started, Will, with your...
Okay. Well, welcome everyone. We're excited to have you here for our Environment and Sanitation Committee meeting. So thank you for joining us. If this is your first time joining us for one of our virtual committee meetings, you'll notice that you're muted and everyone else in the meeting is muted as well, except for the committee co-chairs, Kaz and Barbara, and our presenters. Following each presenter's remarks, the co-chairs will call on members of the public who wish to speak and ask questions of our presenters and about this topic. If you would like to participate, you can do so by going to the reactions icon at the bottom of your screen and pressing the raise hand button there. Do not press the wave or the thumbs up, those will disappear. Look for the button that says raise hand. Only press it once. If you press it a second time, your hand will go back down. If you're calling in from the phone, it's *9 to raise your hand and *6 to unmute. Be on the lookout for a prompt asking you to confirm unmuting once the co-chairs call on you. You'll notice the chat is available, but it's only available for technical support if you're having problems with the Zoom software. Anything you put into the chat will not be seen by the co-chairs or the presenters. If you are using an older version of Zoom, you may need to go to the participants section at the bottom of your screen where you'll find the raise hand feature there. And finally, please do not raise your actual hand or wave at the screen. You're hard to see, and so we may miss it and we may not be able to call on you. So if you're having problems, chat me, I'm here for support. Otherwise, I'll hand it back over to our co-chairs, Barbara and Kaz.
Thanks, Will. Well, welcome to the September Environment and Sanitation meeting. Would you like to take it away, Barbara, and introduce the speakers? And
we'll proceed. First, I'm going to give thanks to Will, who, as always, has been so supportive and wonderful and will run these meetings wonderfully. I also want to thank our chair, Russell Squire, who really encouraged Kaz and I to do this. Kaz Spagnoletti and Barbara Rudder were co-chairs of this committee, and he encouraged us to do this important meeting. We have two great speakers that I really think can shed light on some of the issues that we have. Post-Ida, we understand that we have different issues than we've had before. We have Dr. William Selecki, who is a professor at Hunter. We were so pleased that we have one of our universities in our community, but he's also the CUNY founder and director, you'll correct me, Bill, if I'm wrong, of the CUNY Division of Sustainability, Sustainable Cities, which will be so important for us. And then there's Dr. Nancy Holt, who is the founder of Science for New York, as well as the director of STEM programs and so on that also have been immersed in sustainability. So Dr. Selecki, we could call you William, would you?
Sure. Or Bill.
Or Bill, great, thank you. Would you want to get started and talk about what we can do? What we're hoping to hear is some practical issues besides going to illegal basements and try to get people to be safe, but what we could really do to we could handle this pandemic of a sort that we're having of these rains and water and so on. So thank you very much.
Sure. And thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to present and talk with the local board, the local board in Hunterland. And I do have some slides. I could show you a few slides just to sort of, I will go through them quickly. It's of the professor and me, I want to show you some slides. Will, should I show them or do you want to share the ones that I sent earlier?
You can go ahead. It'll be faster without you asking me to.
All right, so I assume, yep, it looks like I can share. So you should see a picture of a fireman carrying a person, I think. So, you guys see it?
Yes.
Great. Okay. So, Hurricane Ida, or Tropical Storm Ida, or Storm Ida, really, in some ways, was a significant event in many, many different ways. So, qualifying, I don't know. This is somewhere in New York, obviously, but it's not the Upper East Side. So, if anybody's wondering, what corner is that? So, why is this event so significant, and what does it also say about sort of the larger question of climate change? I should also mention, as part of my background, I was the co-chair of the New York City panel on climate change for 3 cycles, or basically 11 years. So I've been very much steeped in like what the city is thinking about, has been thinking about with respect to climate change. And this particular event was, quite different in some ways, and sort of unfortunately opens up a new window into sort of some of the issues that we might want to be thinking about for today and moving forward. Let me go to the next slide if I can. Okay. So what I want to do is talk a little about climate current risk, and some of these slides were from a colleague of mine at the New School, Timon McPherson, which I'll talk about in a moment. So a couple of weeks back now, for Ida, we sort of had some inklings that there was going to be a big rain event, and these are a couple of forecasts that came out. And if you look at excessive rainfall totals and forecast numbers, I mean, these numbers are, if you look at the slide on the graphic on the right, you see lots of oranges and reds. This is sort of mixes with 4-6 inches, a couple of cases 6 to 8 inches. So these are pretty significant, if not massive, totals. I mean, many of us, certainly from my childhood, anything more than an inch or more, inch or two, was a big rainfall in the city. And of course, the city's subways and a lot of the infrastructure is geared to handle a certain amount of rain. The drains, et cetera. It's usually something around, as much as sort of an inch every couple of hours, and then maybe 3 or so inches over the course of 24 hours. This storm sort of, went way beyond that. Now, the other thing, of course, we recognize is that the actual recorded rainfall, was in some cases much higher than some of these projected totals. And this is, shows you some weather data with rainfall totals. And there was this swath of territory, starting in through southeast Pennsylvania, through central New Jersey, and then on into the city. New York Central Park, I think, got about 6.5 inches of rain or so over that period. Up into the Bronx, got towards 7. Parts of Queens also got a lot as well. But I think the crucial question, is like, well, what was the big factor here? What was the big question in terms of flooding? So if you look at these two maps, this kind of highlights a little bit about the New York metropolitan region, or New York City specifically. And one couple of things to sort of look at here is, sorry, I've got a cat who's trying to jump up and see the slides as well. So the gray areas are those areas that are at very at very low levels of risk from flooding, from coastal flooding. And what you see particularly, so here is Manhattan. Hopefully you can sort of all see that sort of general outline. Central Park is sort of in the middle. Upper East Side, for the most part, is at higher elevation. We see that break point going into East Harlem, where suddenly you're kind of pancaking down at quite low elevation. So East Harlem, in particular, is very much at risk to coastal flooding. Now, the other thing, if you look at this is inland flood risk. This is a slightly different map. Now, this is a composite map, and it's not a perfect map by any means, but what it does is sort of illustrates a very different sort of picture of potential flooding. And one of the reasons here that's really significant is this issue of inland flooding because of impervious surfaces, right? The cities, if you look down at the city, much of the city's surface, particularly on the Upper East Side, is impervious, meaning it's like completely, concrete or asphalt or other surfaces. So when rain hits it, it sort of washes off in particular ways. And I just want to sort of, have you kind of focus on that graphic for a moment. I think one of the things that Ida did in particular is that why it was so striking and why it was so problematic was the issue that we haven't really had an experience where we've got that much rainfall in such a little amount of time. And we truly don't have the engineering, we don't have the sort of understanding as to where the water is going to go. And this is particularly, significant because, the city has spent, decades with the federal government and state level administrators as well to sort of designate flood zones, places that might flood, and particularly in the coastal zone here or in other locations along the water's edge or low-lying elevation areas throughout the city. But they haven't really done as sort of a kind of a direct job to understand what happens when you get this sort of massive amount of water inundating, a city landscape the way that did. Now that has obviously spurred the de Blasio administration. They've just recently come out with a kind of a very initial kind of report, but it's still developing about, what the damage extent was and what are some possible, resolutions that the city is trying to sort of look at. And they're particularly looking at, obviously, at these basement apartments, but there's a range of other things. And in some ways it's some of the proposals to date are pretty simple, meaning that they're just sort of what's, low-hanging fruit. But to be honest, to sort of look at the larger question of like, what are the implications for the urban landscape with this kind of extensive flooding, it really will, it has unearthed a series of other like more profound questions about how do you build a city landscape to, very occasionally, but increasingly so, take on this volume of water. I just want to toggle through just a little bit. The other issue, of course, for the Upper East Side and for the city as well, in fact, the most important kind of environmental risk that the city is focused on is the issue of heat and excessive heat, particularly summertime heat, particularly overnight heat, and the implications that has for human health and well-being. There's a long story to talk about. There are some areas that are the city that are more exposed and prone to heating events. Partially, it's sort of the locational characteristics, but a lot of it has to do with the nature of the building stock, and particularly the surface materials, as well as whether or not the materials are brick or other types of materials and where the heat can retain. And so this is sort of a composite look at like those places. The Upper East Side around Hunter isn't too bad. There are some spots, I believe these are, in some cases, some of the older brownstones, which have the black tar roofs, and then some of the newer apartments and others, have a very different and composite. But then, of course, you go into back into East Harlem, into Harlem more proper. A lot of the low, walk-ups and so forth have the black tar roofs and become, potential heat sites and urban heat island. What I want to do is just end off with a little bit of and then open it up for questions and some other comments. This issue of, the future risk. So a lot of my work is looking at current risk, but a lot of it, in the context of climate change. Of course, we know that the city is built upon issues of risk. All of the standard design for windows, for example, is that it needs to withstand a 3-second burst of about a 98-mile-an-hour wind. So there's lots of design elements that are already built into buildings and our landscape for our current risk. We know that our future climate risk is sort of changing. This is just some data from the New York City panel on climate change. It's showing from here, this is sort of current, this is observed data for temperature. Real quick story, it's showing increasing over this next century, steady increasing average temperature. And also with sea level rise, we know the sea levels are starting to rise in and around the city of New York. That leads to sort of more frequent flooding events, in some cases high tide flooding. Again, not something specific to the east side, but to the city generally. Precipitation in general also is showing a steady increase. The big issue with both temperature and precipitation, these are the models of like what the climate projections illustrate. But I think one of the big things, a big takeaway for us here, is that it's really difficult and very complicated to then figure out, well, what happens with an extreme event? Will we get like these intense heat waves? Will we get these intense rainstorms again? It's estimated that Ida, the rainfall that we saw in Ida is probably somewhere between a 1 in 500 and 1 in 1,000 year event. Now, we also recognize with climate change that the frequency of that type of an event is increasing. And so these numbers don't mean as much as they once did because the climate is dynamic, the climate is changing. And then, so some of the work for the New York City Panel on Climate Change has been looking at, well, what that might mean in terms of future flooding. And we sort of recognize that the same flooding events, which are highlighted here in this sort of kind of purplish color, if you sort of telescope them out into the future decades of this century, will start to sort of flood more and more territory. Again, Upper East Side in general is somewhat immune given the nature of Manhattan more broadly defined, but many other parts of the city don't have those same qualities. And I think that was sort of, let me sort of stop. Those were just some kind of intro things to get you thinking about stuff. Barbara opened up with the question of like what to do now, like how do we approach these kinds of issues? It's a huge challenge. I think there's going to be a lot of engineering work to try to understand what the implications for this are going to be. I think what we're going to start to see is and already proposed is a series of initiatives potentially to sort of look at how to manage our infrastructure below grade. I mean, they've already done a lot of work post-Hurricane Sandy to protect the subways from coastal flooding, but they haven't really moved as aggressively to protect it from this kind of street level flooding. There was always an assumption that you would get like, flooding like this every 3 years in cities, in the city subways. Now we're finding it, maybe once a year, and in this case, particularly catastrophic. So I think it's going to be a specific to flooding and Hurricane Ida. I think there's going to be a long series of questions about how to manage it. And I think there's going to be some new regulations on how to either move, not allow people to be in those low basements, but also protecting other infrastructure that we might have down there, furnaces, other sorts of pumping equipment that are oftentimes in buildings. And then, of course, the heat issue is something that is sort of not present at the moment, but overall the city is most concerned about and has been working really aggressively to try to minimize urban heat island. But that work continues as the prospects of future warming continue as well. So I think I see some hands up, unless those are hands to tell me to stop talking.
No, we don't want to. We would keep you talking. I'm
So
wondering, do you
I'll
think
stop.
Nancy should present? Nancy, do you think you should present also to give it a full review before questions, or should we have questions now? What do you think, Nancy?
I'm happy to do either. It might be easier just to kind of do both presentations together, I think.
I'm sorry, it's better for you.
Yeah, I think it'd be easier to do both the presentations together, but
I think that's better too.
Okay.
So let me share my screen. I need to be allowed to share this.
You can now. Sorry.
Okay, no problem. So hopefully this one. Okay, so I'm just making sure I can see people. So I'm going to talk a little bit just about work we've been doing as an organization. We're a student-led we're scientists who are trying to support the city. I have a different perspective from Professor Selecki, who has a long, extensive history in working on these issues. We're taking more of the perspective of, as scientists, what public information is out there and how can we help connect it to communities. So this is sort of our climate journey to Manhattan Community Board 8. I'll say this actually started more looking at council districts. So we had a few people approach us who are interested in having us help synthesize information in their areas. So this is kind of the slimmed down version to Manhattan Community Board 8, but we have made a snapshot for Council District 5. Sorry, I'm looking at the wrong part of my PowerPoint. Okay. So as I mentioned, we're a group of local scientists, and we're just basically striving to connect science and data to communities and to support policymakers. And our goal is to improve the well-being of New York City. Some of the questions I have maybe that can help spur a conversation is just sort of how much has the conversation on flooding picked up in your areas, how much pre-Sandy, post-Sandy, and post-Ida. So obviously this conversation is now coming back, and how much more do you see it coming back? How well do you feel you understand the flooding issues in your community and the options for solutions? Do you interact with city data and science-based sources? Do you know where to find them? Do you find them easier to use? They're challenging. What else would you like to see? And then basically, if we could offer scientific support to you, what is it you really feel your community needs are? So, sort of in this big zooming out citywide, which Professor Selecki already spoke about a bit, one of the things we tried to do when we were literally trying to kind of understand the lay of the land was we went through a bunch of public sources, including Community Board Statement of Needs, to see if we could make a science policy map of New York City, or sort of science in your neighborhood, and figure out in some way, without directly talking to all the community boards, but using the data to see like what's really an issue of science that is reaching across the city, and specifically in each community board. You'll see there's a lot of blue on this map, which kind of makes sense, right? Areas like Staten Island and the Rockaways, parts of the Bronx are on the coast, and resiliency is an issue. From the Statement of Needs for Manhattan 8 actually was STEM access. So it's STEM and broadband access. We grouped those together, but in different districts, they can mean different things. But that's what we came up with from our analysis to see what people were actually talking about in Manhattan 8. If you're interested, this piece actually was published as an op-ed. It's funny, Kristen is on this call. She's one of our volunteers and helped us write that op-ed. And then it was taken into a report that was released on Earth Day of this year by the Mayor's Office of Climate Resiliency. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that project was toward the end. So, our approach, like I said, is different from Professor Selecki's. We're not sort of studying it. We're kind of trying to condense, compare, and compile public data in order to lend support to communities, ideas, support, synthesis. And if you haven't seen it before, there's this great map by Beta NYC that helps you understand the boundaries and the overlays. So how much of Manhattan 8 is in Community Board 5, how much is in Community Board 4, what are the council districts, what are the community boards that make up a given council district, et cetera, et cetera. You can also see other things like school districts, other assembly districts, congressional districts. And the original idea, as I said, originated from some people who are running for council, who will hopefully be in the council starting next year. They wanted to know about their neighborhoods. So we had this conversation with them that said, like, what is it you really want to know? And we kind of came down to these topics. Obviously, flooding, that's a big one. So what is the flood zone? Who's in the flood zone? What kind of infrastructure? What kind of buildings? Stormwater flooding, there's a recent report on that that came about since we released the original climate snapshots, which we've been now integrating in. Clearly, urban heat island is a major issue, and health-related disparities. And then we looked at sort of other things, so geography, income levels, miles of coastline, climate-related infrastructure such as sewers, wastewater, and people typically know, what wastewater treatment plant serves them. Is that plant being repaired? What are the situation for the sewers? Energy plants, where are the peaker plants? Is kind of interesting to me now that I can kind of like look out on the landscape and say, oh, I know what plant that is. Socioeconomic factors, like I mentioned, climate justice issues, and health and well-being. So I'm not going to go through all of those here, but just to kind of let you know what we looked at and what we tried to piece together. And so these are the flood zones, as you may have seen these maps many times, and they show you how likely an area is to flood. These are the 2015 maps. They're going to be updated for New York City at some point soon, I think, to deal with insurance-related issues, but they do focus on areas near waterways. So they're looking largely at, the East River and places like the Rockaways, the Atlantic Ocean. They're showing you any place with a greater than or equal to 1% chance of experiencing a flood each year, and those are considered to have high risk, or any place that has a greater than 1% chance of flooding each year is considered to have high risk, and those areas have at least a 1 in 4 chance of flooding during a 30-year mortgage. And the 100-year flood zone is shown in the V zone and the A zone, and the 500-year flood is shown in the shaded X zone. And if you're interested more in how to read those things and understand those things, I'm happy to talk about that separately another time. You can look in the community district profiles and you can see kind of estimates of how many people are actually in those flood zones. So these are the Manhattan 8 estimates, what the incomes are for people in those flood zones. So people who live in those flood zones in Manhattan 8 have greater incomes than the citywide average, but lower than their neighbors for the most part in Manhattan 8, or the average for Manhattan 8, or the median actually for Manhattan 8. And that's a pretty common thing that you see. And the residents of Manhattan 8 that are in the floodplain are in Council District 5, because of where the coast splits. We looked at other things, like we counted the miles of coastline, if that interests you. So there's about 6.2 miles in Manhattan 8, 2.2 on the east side, and the FDR, and 4 miles on Roosevelt Island. And then, we looked at a string of things just to maybe help give people reference points. So if there are points that they know or familiar with in their area, can we give them a sense of how high they are above sea level, or in some cases in Queens, actually how far below sea level they are. We looked at buildings in the flood zones. There's a study of NYC's floodplain by the numbers, so you can get a sense of what's actually in the floodplain. Their dwelling units are listed in the community district profile. So, the breakdown largely is campus complexes, so residing to a university. Multifamily buildings are a quarter about of the units in the flood zone in Manhattan 8. And then some mixed use buildings are about 18% of what's in Manhattan 8's floodplain. There's, like I mentioned, there's new maps out from the city on stormwater flooding. So they give moderate cases, and you can see on the left how that's defined, and extreme cases on the right of how that's defined. And you'll see there's these sort of pockets of areas, the lower 60s in the extreme case, and kind of in the 70s in both the moderate and extreme cases of, what heavy rainfall is going to do. So the key takeaways for flooding, just to kind of put this in context, is there are residential areas, notably on Roosevelt Island and the northern part of Manhattan 8, that are going to be affected. And these residents do have lower median incomes compared to their community board district as a whole. As you guys well know, but I've been to the Upper East Side many times and don't live there. There is notable infrastructure on the coast, including the FDR, parks, particularly those on the north and south of Roosevelt Island. The greenways will be affected, and access to hospitals. And as we just showed, there's these pockets of deep and contiguous and nuisance flooding in the 70s in both the moderate and extreme cases. And then there's a sort of expansion into the 60s. As well as parts of Main Street and Roosevelt Island in the extreme scenario. So this is, I think, a sort of topic that's always hard to wrap my brain around, and I wish I had specific solutions to offer you. I think what I can offer now is, if you don't think about this too much, maybe some delineation of the kinds of things you can do to deal with all of this flooding. There's a map of green infrastructure projects for all of the city, and you can go look at it. And on the left is shown what's going on in Manhattan 8. So there's a couple of green roofs and one soil project under the citywide efforts. And to give you just a better sense of what green infrastructure can do, and is on the right, and kind of the options that are out there for green infrastructure, things that really can basically get the water away without it entering the sewer system or causing too much general chaos. There's other things that people talk about. There's gray and blue infrastructure. So the gray infrastructure is another list of things. And people often think of the sewers or the physical sewerage that transmits water. As you probably know, combined sewers are a major issue for New York City and leading to combined sewer overflows. 60% of New York sewers, or approximately, can generate combined sewer overflows. They are connected in both the sewerage pipes and the drainage pipes. So in a heavy flood event, the optimal situation is not to dump sewage on the street, it's to dump it out to the rivers and to the waterways. And around Manhattan 8, there are some CSOs. They tend to be smaller in volume than other parts of the city see, but they are still there out onto the East River. And then you start to think about the water elements when you start to deal with resiliency and building up the city. And you, in case you are interested, A lot of Manhattan 8 is covered by Ward's Island, and there is some investment in upgrading Ward's Island and also just generally improving its overall efficiency so it doesn't put out as much greenhouse gas emissions. But just sort of to give you a sense of all of the things that are kind of tied into this challenge and what happens when things flood. And it's not just the rain you see on the street, but there's sort of a series of events that also go along with that kind of flooding. So there's other measures, and I think they're just sort of trying to give you a sample, right? I think kind of one of the main takeaways that I'm seeing is that, what you deal with on the east side toward Fifth Avenue is different than what you have to deal with for the FDR, and different than a little bit from Roosevelt Island, which is sort of this thin, narrow island. Some of these won't apply in Manhattan 8, but they are natural and engineering, much more large scale changes that you can make in order to build up kind of some way of dissipating or mitigating damage from flooding. And then there's stuff beyond the physical infrastructure. So there's the physical infrastructure, but then there's social infrastructure. So things like community boards, how neighbors work together, how they develop plans. Even though flooding isn't ideal, the more a community is prepared, knows its neighbors, and works together, usually the better the outcome. There's legislation. Obviously, there's a number of pending things, and I'm sure the city will be doing much more work in strategic planning. But this is just an example. There's Intro 1620. There's a look to make a comprehensive 5-borough coastal resiliency plan. There's all these discussions of who should be living where and whether we can continue to build and whether we need to move off of certain areas. And then there's the sort of housing issues. So, as we've mentioned, upgrades you can make to your homes. There was an op-ed recently by Councilmember Brannan talking about backwater valves, which are an easy way of maybe the city paying to install these things so there isn't a backup of sewer in your basement during flooding, and other ways that we can zone for coastal resiliency to allow homeowners to take up retrofits that will serve them better in heavy downfalls. So, just from where I stand, and like I said, it's a different position from someone who studies it all the time. It's more someone who's trying to translate this information so that communities have a view of what's going on. The challenge of climate change, and this is kind of an obvious statement, but I still think it's worth saying, is it's a global problem with very local impacts. And there are impacts across the city, but as you look, they're different in each area somehow. And that makes it hard to look at, even sometimes when you plan across the city, it's still useful to look at a specific geography and a specific community. And I think it would be nice, and I don't know how much work is being done, but for really community-specific or community-led efforts, you just, even in Manhattan 8, is that the stormwater flooding can be very different from the solutions that you need on the FDR, from the solutions you really want on Roosevelt Island. And I think in all cases, it's not just one of those infrastructure pieces, it's sort of some combination of them. The city is attempting to kind of go on this more community-specific route. And I had mentioned that the plot I had showed you of our science policy issues citywide had appeared in something called the Climate Knowledge Exchange report. The report is actually called the State of Climate Knowledge, but the idea is to have communities feed more information to the city to help set research priorities. So instead of the city just saying, these are the things we need to study, communities can actually come in and say, no, here's what we really think is a priority for us, and that can help set a research agenda. And that's pretty novel and pretty cool. On the downside, it requires a lot of manpower, and I think all cities right now are facing staffing challenges and other issues, and obviously flooding is a big problem that also needs to be dealt with in a very immediate way. So if I, as a scientist, could have a wish list, I would say I'd really like to see a more user-friendly, climate-focused interface. I think it's really challenging. I've dealt with data for many years. That doesn't make me an expert, but I am familiar with it, and I still find it very difficult to kind of navigate the city. I think sometimes it's a bit of a scavenger hunt, different maps, spending a lot of time trying to overlay things on what streets and what community boards and what council districts. And it would be really great for us as scientists to have an easier way, and I'm really excited to hear what you guys are going to say, just to understand really what's going on in a community, what's really priority concerns. Like I said, we had to infer them from community statements of needs, financial statements of needs, excuse me, in the community board profiles. But it would be interesting to hear it directly from communities and be able to have those kinds of conversations. So I'll leave you with that. There's our email if you can contact us if you have other questions following the meeting, and I'm happy to answer any questions I can.
Thank you so much for both of you. I have a million questions, but Will, shall we go first to the public and then the community board? And
yeah, you have two members of the public who have their hands up, three now. Zachary, Dara, and Wendy.
Okay.
Okay.
And I'm going to go ahead and unmute.
First.
Would you say, Kaz?
Yeah, let's go to Zachary first.
Go ahead, Zachary. Look for a button to unmute.
Yeah, so thank you. It's nice to meet everyone. I just moved to this neighborhood 3 months ago and absolutely love the community and the never sleep vibe that it gives off. It's great to be part of this community. But anyway, I wanted to comment because I am a disability rights advocate. I have been for about a couple of years now, and disability and climate change resiliency are just starting to come into the conversation. And I would just like to share just some quick thoughts on this that I composed over the last couple of days. So New York is one of many states that are simultaneously affected by rising temperatures and rising sea levels. Regardless of the type of disability, people with disabilities will be negatively impacted by climate change. Extreme heat will impact people with neurological and physical conditions, such as those with respiratory and cognitive-based disabilities. This will also impact people who are autoimmune compromised as the spread of diseases increases. Extreme flooding will lead to loss of power in homes. Many people with disabilities rely on devices to assist with breathing and other bodily functions and will lose their lives without them. Those that are rescued may be placed in settings that are inaccessible and that are lacking in essential resources. People with spinal cord injuries, spinal bifida, cerebral palsy, like myself, and other physical conditions may experience discomfort if they are sensitive to touch or movement during an evacuation. State and local emergency management agencies should prioritize trainings that account for the types of disabilities and how they are affected during natural disasters and evacuations. Agencies should also establish procedural guidelines during emergencies to ensure safety and security. Funding can also be provided for environmental agencies, emergency management agencies, and disability organizations when rebuilding after disasters. And this ties in to the end of the presentation's wish list, because community boards can collaborate with one another to establish checklists of what communities' needs are and take feedback from each part of the community and establish performance measures to make sure that we're meeting our climate goals as community boards and communities. So thank you for your time. And again, I think this is a great idea and has the potential to really make a positive impact.
thank you, Zach.
Thanks, Zachary. Yeah, we've got to start somewhere soon.
You're giving us a lot of work, Zachary.
I appreciate that. I look forward to working with all of you.
Thank you. You did give your email address, I assume, when you signed in, Zachary?
Yes, but I'll also put it in the chat.
Will, would you capture it?
Yep.
Great,
Yep.
thank you. Okay.
You have Dara, then Wendy, then Andrew. And Bill, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to respond to Zachary. I mean, it's a critical point. It's actually, there's a literature, in the disaster literature, disaster preparedness on, folks with disabilities, implications, and you're absolutely right. I mean, it's been a point of focus, and certainly post Sandy, we saw very clear evidence of that. When power was out for folks, anytime there's a power outage, I mean, this is a huge question mark. So you're right on target.
Nancy, do you have anything you want to add? Or
No, I mean, it's an incredibly important point, and unfortunately it wasn't really one that I stopped to think of until you mentioned it. But no, it's definitely something we have to do better at and think about more. It needs to be on our radar more for sure.
And I will say one demographic of our community is we are a growing senior community with older people, and you'll see a lot of people with disabilities. So that is one, one profile of our neighborhood that you had asked for, is that it's not an unusual thing in our neighborhood. Thank you. Will,
So next you have Dara. Dara, you can go ahead and unmute. Dara, you can go ahead and unmute. If not, we'll move on to Wendy. Why don't we come back to Dara? Dara, we'll come back to you. Wendy, go ahead and unmute.
Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Excellent. I want to thank you so much, guests, for coming, and Barbara and Kaz and Will also for organizing this meeting. I've been waiting for you all for all summer, and I'm so glad that you're all here, and I really appreciate the presenters very much. I want to build on one thing that Zachary said, which is, and also what Barbara just said, is that District CB8 has the largest population of ambulatory sentient seniors in the city of New York. And we also have a very vibrant disabilities population. In my building alone, we have apartments where we have clients of various organizations and various levels of care and need. It's a really important cause, and climate change pollution affects these populations and also populations of color more than populations of more privilege. One factor, we spoke a little bit about green space, and we also, and greening of space, and also about rooftops. I do want to say that I'm very lucky. I happen to live a little bit above the ground, and I'm able to take pictures. I love looking at, cloud patterns and whatever. None of the rooftops in my area are blacktop, not in the blocks between the river and 2nd Avenue, between 80th and 81st, and then looking uptown at 1st Avenue. None of those are blacktop roofs. I'm sure that is a problem, but those must have been remediated in many years ago. They're all very pale tops, and that is a factor. But the larger factor in the Heat Island Index is the interaction between tall buildings, and there's a lot of robust data on this, both from Asia and even the DEC in New York, emission of climate change pollution above the 10th floor and above the 20th floor. But it's a very difficult, inconvenient truth. We don't really, we're kind of depending on our builders and our developers to stimulate our economy and try to give us community services, but it's really not happening. And what we really need as a community and as a city is to have some limits, some really reasonable limits, instead of the race to the sky, so that we can reduce the emissions of these buildings and reduce the Heat Island Index, reduce these emissions that are affecting all of us every day in terms of health, asthma, heart attacks, heart disease, as well as in the rising levels of the Atlantic. We are 4 islands and a peninsula, and we're very dependent, especially on the east side of Manhattan, in terms of Manhattan. I mean, certainly not, the other boroughs have their own challenges, but the east side of Manhattan is more subject than the west side, as we saw in Superstorm Sandy. I have video of the kayaking lanes that are the FDR Drive when we had Superstorm Sandy, and I don't think that that is going to be an unusual phenomenon if we don't have a robust plan that includes the inconvenient truth that we really need these height limits, in addition to taking some land that is currently inland of the river and inland of Central Park, sort of in the mid zone of the populated area, and put in some park space and green space. In addition, especially because of construction and development, many of the trees that were planted have been routed out and torn down. I was part of a committee on from the East 79th Street Neighborhood Association, and we did tree data studies, really exhaustive, let me tell you, studies having to do with every single tree, counted for every single tree, every empty tree bed in our area. And it's worse now than it was in 2019. So I'm hoping that if you're looking for feedback from the community, we need absolutely kept so that there's no way.
We're having a tough time hearing you now, Wendy. I don't know if you have to be closer to your.
Irreparable harm.
Yeah. Do you want to just say the last sentence over again, please?
I haven't moved, but you know,
Oh, good, perfect.
So
perfect.
maybe.
Yes.
But you. Oh, can you hear me now?
Perfect.
Oh, okay. So I think that in terms of community need, we need height caps. We have height caps that signal to developers what they can build, and so they can plan reasonably. It's not fair to say to give them one rule one day, another rule
Sound is, yeah, I think.
another day. It's only fair to have them as part of it with climate change, pollution concerns. In case anybody wants to know, it was the Council on Tall Buildings and Urban Habitat, which is a developing publication that published the graphs on the 10th floor and the 20th data, but it's all similarly with the DC, and also a review article in Scientific American. And there are more, there's a limit of time and I don't want to hog the whole show, but we need absolutely more green space, more supportive trees, penalties for knocking them down and not replacing them immediately. But really the height limits are the big thing. They cause 67 to 75% of our climate change pollution. All of the other measures, all of the other concerns come, whether it's cars or push carts or who's running diesel fuel or fireplaces, all of that together is 25%. Certainly worth pursuing, but it is not the big enchilada on the plate. Thank you for letting me talk.
Thank you. Community. I just, with disabilities, I just want to say one other thing, that Roosevelt Island, I don't know if anybody's here from Roosevelt Island, is a major disability. They were, a community that's there, so that we add to the profile. Thank you, Wendy.
Thank you.
Will, is there a next person?
Sorry, let's go back to Dara. I saw her on mute. I'm sorry.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
I want to call attention to a very specific flooding concern in our neighborhood on the Upper East Side. It's the East 91st Street Marine Transfer Station, which is a DSNY facility used to collect putrescible waste from 5 community districts in Manhattan. It's been in operation for some years. While it was being designed, Sandy happened, and DSNY commissioned a flood study on it by Greeley and Hansen. I am hoping that the scientists involved here have read that report. It was breathtaking, and the majority of recommendations in the report to mitigate flood risk at this waste facility right on our border were not implemented. If you have not read those reports, and I would urge the community board members to do so as well, it's very important that we all know about this risk. At that time in 2013, less was known about the severity of sea level rise and other flooding factors than are known now. And right now, the MTS is not causing flood danger, but it's something that must be on our radar system.
Thank you. I don't know if the two speakers know about the Marine Transfer Station.
I mean, I know of it. I don't know the details of the flooding right around it.
It is functioning at this point.
Yeah, I could speak, I mean, to the larger question. I mean, I think it was Dara who's bringing it up, that these sorts of facilities, whether they're sort of solid waste or hazardous waste or storage facilities or process facilities, they do become an issue, certainly in any flooding event. I mean, again, Hurricane Sandy, unfortunately, is sort of the benchmark on a lot of this. That was a huge There's a lot of sort of lowland areas that were inundated, particularly in Brooklyn, and drums of stuff went missing. And I think it's, it is critical to sort of evaluate what's in the flood zone for those kinds of events.
But considering what was known 10 years ago and what was suggested 10 years ago, how much has been implemented that was suggested?
It's a really good question. There has been some. I don't think there's been nearly, to the extent that I think people would have hoped. And obviously, there's a lot of these facilities are still present. And there's some anecdotal stuff from Ida, where also, things, were washed away that were being stored. I don't have a good answer, so I'll just say that there is some progress, but I think there's a tremendous amount of progress still yet to be done. That I can tell you.
Thanks. Who do we have next? Is it Andrew?
Correct. Andrew Ravishir.
Hi, thank you everyone for holding this forum. And before we begin, I just want to say, Zachary, welcome to the neighborhood. I'm so happy that you're enjoying it here, and we are so glad to have you be a member of the community. Focusing more on climate change aspects and environmental aspects, I'm so thrilled that we're talking about the urban heat island, because I know that when I began testifying a year and a half ago on this, I looked like a crazy scientific madman because it was some esoteric topic that now is starting to get very much mainstream focus, and I'm very grateful for that. So I have two questions relating to it. Hopefully both will be short. The first is, I know that in Arizona, oddly enough, maybe because it's a desert and it's already super hot, they're doing a ton of research on the types of concrete, road surface and building surfaces that will help reduce the urban heat island. I just saw a piece that said planting copious amount of trees can reduce the air temperature to around 8 degrees Fahrenheit, but obviously a total restructuring of building surfaces and concrete is probably essential. So I don't know if any of that research is happening in New York, but if you could just touch on if any of that research is happening, that'd be great, and what surfaces we're finding to be promising. The second question I have is that in doing research on urban heat islands, it's very hard to find sort of a standard definition of a radius of the urban heat island effect. In other words, if I have a cluster of very tall buildings in Midtown, how much does that pollution and that heat stay within that area, and how much then does it affect nearby areas? And so if you have any research on that, I'm all ears, because I'd really love to learn. Thank you.
And if you, Bill or Nancy, can you?
I can respond,
You wanna
but
comment?
Nancy, if Nancy wants to respond.
Yeah, no, I don't have specific info, I think, to lend to that one. I mean, the more, obviously, the concrete is more the permeable concrete side. I haven't seen as much research on the actual materials and which ones are more reflective. I know there's some ability to paint streets, obviously, and just reflect heat. I think they do that, or they're starting to do that in Asia. But that's sort of the extent that I can lend.
Wasn't there some white paint or some paint that was done recently that reflects much more light and heat than any other paint?
Yeah, there was an article about paint that's extremely white, and it ultimately leads to some kind of local cooling effect, and it's like the whitest paint they've ever been able to create. I believe when you said that, I remember reading some article, but I would have to look it up for details. And I don't, Professor Sluck, you might know, but I don't know if there's any idea to implement that in New York. I mean, I know obviously we paint roofs white, so it would seem a logical thing to think about streets as well, but could be blinding if you're walking on them.
Yeah.
Well, it's a really interesting set of questions about like how to reimagine sort of the landscape of the city, the streetscape. So, quick thing, I mean, what we're talking about is the albedo, the reflectance, right? So how much, and the interesting thing is that not all white paints are the same. So you really have to sort of understand like the different, like how much could it actually, reflect or not. The other thing, there are I think your first question was about, research that's being done. There are a series of, different sort of attempts, and there's been a big battle, a science battle, if you will, starting back in around 2000 about, okay, so what kinds of surfaces are best? Some people are talking about green roofs. That green roofs, also provide, some cooling as opposed to white roofs. And there's a series of test sites. There's some colleague, the Javits Center has a green roof on it, for example. Other places, in Brooklyn have been, most colleges, universities of various types have had these experiments running. Sometimes they're high schools, running with experiments. So there's a number of them out there. I could try to get you. There's the New York City has a heat it's parallel to the New York City panel on climate change. It's like the heat panel or something. I've forgotten the name of it at the moment, but there's folks who might be able to give the board more information specifically on how these experiments are going. With regard to your second question about the scale question, that's really kind of a big issue as well. The science is really very intricate there, because certainly we know that certain buildings, if they're dark or they're with brick, it's all about how, the amount of solar energy there's, that hits the Earth's surface between Midtown Manhattan and sort of way out on Long Island or New Jersey or whatever is obviously the same. It's like, how is it stored is part of the issue, as also what are some of the human caused sources of heat, and basically what happens is the heating is much more intense, or the lack of cooling at night is the huge issue. So you have, particularly now, like this time of year, Manhattan is going to stay maybe 10 degrees warmer than you would see out in the outlying suburbs, for a variety of reasons. It's about the heat retention. But the question specifically about the scale issue, so you can get a lot of building data, and if you change the building, you'll get cooler. And then, of course, if you look at the whole metro area, you can also see impacts of urban heat island. But this sort of bleed over effect is really complicated. And so I actually did why I was sort of joking when you mentioned it, or laughing or whatever, smiling to myself, was that we did a big study looking at Central Park, the influence of Central Park. And can we see any bleed over effect of that huge swath of 840 acres of green space, in the neighboring streets? You can maybe see a little bit to Madison Avenue if you're coming off the park. But by the time you hit Park and then, further east, you're not going to see, a lot of influence of Central Park. But the research continues, looking at these sort of the impacts of sort of small pockets of green space. Tel Aviv in Israel has a pretty extensive program with these little sort of pocket parks throughout, providing cooling spots, throughout the city. So, research continues on that regard, but that middle space is really hard to define.
Thank you so much.
I guess that's it for the public. Let's go to Ed.
Go ahead, Ed.
Thanks, Will. Thanks, Kaz. Thanks, Barbara. Professor, I have a question for you, and Insulate, I have a question for you, just an inquiry question. I guess they're all tied up, and building on what you were just talking about, Professor. My question from Ms. Holt was, looking at your map of the city, I saw, in terms of what our needs were based in science, on that the top issues for us were STEM and broadband, but I did not see us listed on the park access. I take no issue with the STEM and the broadband. I was curious as to what the criteria was for the park access, because as the professor was just talking about, community District 8, Council District 5 in particular, not only are we last in green space, but we're outstripping the competition on that one. And I was just curious as to the criteria for the park access in terms of being included. And then my question for the professor, maybe for both of you, was on the professor's map as to Roosevelt Island and the flooding. It looked like in terms of coastal flooding, the real part of this community district that seems most at risk, although we do have some of ours, is Roosevelt Island. Seemed to really be getting it all around, because it really truly is, that smaller island versus Manhattan. And I was wondering if you could speak to some remediation efforts or things along those lines. for Roosevelt Island to the extent that you already hadn't. And that was all I had. Thanks.
Sure. So in speaking to the map, it's a little bit of art and a little bit of science. And some of it was people having to make some kind of decision at the end of the day that one thing needed to wind up on the map. And it's a little bit, like I said, inferred. So it's not like there's some science policy box that anyone checks somewhere in the city. So we have to kind of go through what the community is talking about in public documents. And then there would have been secondary issues in there, and parks may have come up. I'm sure at some point they come up. And there's a little bit of like a time snapshot, right? Because we're looking at the financial statement of needs and then other public data, which is in the past. So things are also changing in time. What we really want to do is make a map that's a little bit more dimensional so that we can show the layer of issues in an area. And we've done some work with Columbia and Lehman now to deal with the fact that a lot of the city's data is in PDF format, which makes it hard to plot and blah, blah, blah. Some data analytics students have helped us with that. So we're hoping to make kind of a 2.0 and an interactive map that will allow you to go in and click and actually see the kind of suite of issues. In terms of park access, obviously more green space would help in your district with some of the heat. And then it's an issue of like where the parks can actually be. But it's funny because all of these titles that we kind of had to bin in, like Van Cortlandt is obviously a huge park too, but there's not a lot of easy ways for residents to get to it. So it can mean either you have a big park and it's hard to get to, or you don't have parks, and some of that's hard to kind of show on a one-dimensional map. But it is something we're very interested in because I think it does help connect the public, it helps engage the public. And it would be wonderful, actually, instead of having to dig through the statements, to somehow actually get the community to tell us. And we can also recreate a map in that way. So we're open to, we'd love to hear more kind of thing.
Sure. Thanks.
Next
Who do we
is
have
Lynn.
next?
Well,
Lynn?
I was going to respond.
Oh, go, Bill. Go. Sorry.
Just real quick on Governor's Island, just if I could. Yeah, it's again a huge issue how to manage these like really at-risk locations. I mean, it's like, the Rockaways, East Harlem. I mean, there are some like places, Broad Channel, if you know that neighborhood, Howard Beach. These are all places that are like right at sea level. And are going to be, and Lower Manhattan for that matter too. So going to be much more frequently flooded in the future, potentially, in a catastrophic way if there's a large, Sandy type storm. So the policies break into two directions. One is sort of like large scale barriers, all right, which are expensive, which, create, a whole bunch of issues, engineering as well as sort of amenity. There are some soft ways to do it, like putting up berms and so forth, which take up a lot of space. There's also, places like like if you look at Miami and places like that, what they've done is basically made it so that the first floors of buildings are blowout zones. So when you do have that flooding, there's nothing going to be that's, very significant. But it will take a kind of a comprehensive effort to sort of think about how to, protect these areas if, in fact, that's the long-term strategy.
Can I just ask Professor Zlecki? So I spent a lot of time going, there must be some plan, right? We have the resilient neighborhoods, like you mentioned, for Queens. Is there some, like, I couldn't really find anything that came up to Roosevelt Island. Like, is it on the city's? I just kept thinking, like, there's got to be something. And I'm like, I know we have to elevate it. And I know
Lynn
it's
is here.
but it was just hard to find the details.
Not that I know of. Yeah, it's a good question. Not that I know of.
Well, Lynn is next to speak, and she's Miss Roosevelt Island, so.
Okay.
Thank you, Barbara. Thank you, Kaz. Thank everybody. So I'd like to talk really quickly on I'm the chair of the Roosevelt Island Committee for CB8, and I'd like to talk really quickly about what has been happening here and some of the directions that we want to move in and what our discussion locally has been about. So really quickly, what we've done and started to do is we've redone our southern coastline to have the riffraff and stuff like that. So when the flooding comes, comes, it goes out without, and then it doesn't stay here. So we're starting to do riffraff up the island is one of the things that we're doing and we're working on. So we're working on the coastline. We've added 2 new green roofs here just recently, one on top of the public school, and the other is one of the outdoor comfort stations for in our community. The other thing is we have set up berms here up at the north end of the island. We're looking at other better solutions for there. In the next 3 years, we'll be adding 4.5 acres. And I want to say this again, 4.5 acres of green space parkland to the north part of our community, which I am personally super excited about. And then what we're not doing well yet, and where we would love to have a conversation with you all about, is protecting our subway station. We have one of the deepest subway stations in this network. It is one of the areas that does get flooded, so we need better thinking behind how to protect that subway station and tunnel. We also have, which is very unique to Roosevelt Island, many, many years ago, decades ago, the island was kept warm and the systems that were run here were from a steam tunnel that generated the heat systems throughout the community. When they closed down the steam factory, we still have our steam tunnels, and because we no longer have the steam flowing through the steam tunnels, they are now going to present a problem for our engineering and protecting the outlying areas of our island, because those are where the steam tunnels are now. One of the things that I know that the discussion has started, because we're really interested in how they've come up with some of the solutions in both the Netherlands and in Singapore, because they have to deal with some of these island issues, and we're hoping that we can address some of those here. 2 of the things that we are talking about in terms of potentially replacing the riprap and some of the seawalls, and we're looking to make sure that they're flood resilient so that the flood comes and then goes out without staying on the island in certain sites within that community. And we're addressing the new types of cement construction that are more resilient, like the 3D printing construction that they're doing now with cement, and also calcium silicate cement in some of those areas where they need to do new and additional work. So those are some of the topics that we've been talking to, on Roosevelt Island. I just want to note that I personally live in the shaded X zone, so that is one of the areas. The thing that I want to comment about knowing how the island is affected is we are higher than Lower Manhattan. So the whole end of Lower Manhattan has to get flooded before we get flooded. And so what you were talking about in terms of those long-term suggestions, and it is actually some of the things that they are doing in the Netherlands to protect their islands and things, is those big arms and things that help mediate flood waters and those kinds of things. That's kind of out of our realm, but that if they do things like that for the southern tip of Manhattan, I'm hoping that they do it also to support the Roosevelt Island community. So I did kind of want to touch base on what we're doing right and and the direction that we're moving, and then also where we haven't got it right yet, but it's on our radar. So those are the things that I know about that are being done in our community, and we are the district, or part of our district, that is at most risk for flooding.
I just want to ask one quick question. Do I remember correctly, Lynn, that you said that you had no effect from Ida, that the Roosevelt Island did not have any effect from Ida?
That's correct. So what we did find out from Ida, and most recently, is that some of the ceiling of the different buildings was not up to some of the more robust storms, but that the flooding issue here was almost minimal. we really did not have flooding during that most recent storm. Yes, Barbara.
Nancy or Bill, any comment?
No, I mean, I think the comment is it's great to hear all of this, and it would be really hard for me to find it from the outside. I don't know if there's some way to either help direct me to where the work is or to catalog.
So it's in the REOC, Roosevelt Island Operating Corporation's capital projects.
Okay.
And we actually, in the Roosevelt Island committee meetings, we review the capital projects that REOC is working on monthly. They come and they give us a report on what are their current projects. And then sometimes I can even arm twist them a little bit on talking about what projects are being discussed. So that may be an avenue for you to find out real time what's happening here.
Or Nancy coming to a Roosevelt Island committee and Bill coming.
No, I'm just wondering, how much of this is going on that isn't easily searchable and should be cataloged into some database so that other communities can share the information. And I guess on that end, though, I had one question actually, because the FDR, obviously, when you try to search, you mostly come up with the FDR in the lower Manhattan part, and you said coastal resiliency. Do you know of like what's going to go on upper parts of the FDR that flood, or is there, like, I don't know what the city's plan currently is, or I assume there is one, but there's a lot of talk about what should be done.
Is that Tricia? Somebody raised their hand?
Yeah, I mean, I'm speaking out of order, but just there is a plan. The Transportation Committee just recently saw a presentation for it. I'm sure Craig Later, whose hand is up too, can also speak to it. They made a presentation just recently about repairs to the FDR that are certainly going to impact access to the Esplanade, but there is a plan at least to repair some of the worst parts of the FDR. Craig, I don't know if you want to speak more to it.
Okay, we'll go to Craig later.
Later or later? His name is Craig Later. So that's why I'm laughing. When you said go to Craig later, oh, I thought you meant later, meaning not now. I'm sorry. Forget it.
Yes, later.
You meant L-A-T-E-R.
Yes.
I'm very confused right now.
So am I.
Well,
Okay.
I guess in response to Tricia, so as she was mentioning, there was a presentation. Actually, it was at Parks, the presentation, I thought, right? Regarding the renovations, the rehabilitation of the Esplanade, and it's a 4-phase process, and they're going to be shutting down different parts of the Esplanade, and at times there are going to have to be closures on the FDR Drive in order to facilitate the reconstruction of it.
But are they just reconstructing, or are they enhancing for safety?
I'll put the slideshow from that meeting into the meeting chat, so we don't have to spend a lot of time on this.
Okay, good. Thanks, Will.
But I think it was the July Parks meeting where the presentation was. So
June.
With all the
I have it.
meetings online, everyone could actually watch the presentation as well.
Link is in the chat.
Great.
Thanks, Will. Can we go to John? He's been waiting patiently.
Good evening.
Thank you, John.
So, there was so much said at kind of different points in this conversation, and I wanted to kind of weigh in on some aspects, and I also wanted to provide information on others. So, Ms. Holt, you probably don't know, but I'm a longtime resident of the Upper East Side, 86th in York, between York and East End. I also own the buildings on the corner, and I have a restaurant there. So during flooding, whether it be Katrina, Sandy, blackouts, or anything like that, we've kind of experienced it from the ground level. One of the big issues right around where I am is that we had a complete breakdown of the drain pipe system. I'll be specific about that. We were leaking water into our basement from the foundation of the building next door because the drain pipes are not big enough. Now we are, I guess, technically above grade where we're situated right now. So you have kind of a combination of long-term and short-term things that could be done to abate any of these circumstances. Now, the very expensive, costly things, I mean, this is going to have to be funded somehow. The city is going to need to get involved. But what I will say is people who are in business tend to respond or react to things that are happening in real time. So 10 years ago, and I forgot who brought that up, I think it was Professor Bill brought this up. 10 years ago, we started repainting our roof to make sure that we were more insulated from the hotter summers. We also started layering up for the kind of more severe winters. When I mean severe, I mean more snow accumulation. So we've been doing that for about 10 years now, and we've seen a difference. Now, our building was built in 1899. So we're a wood frame building, and we cannot support a lot of weight on the roof. Which I'll only mention is green rooftops for buildings who can support that, I think would make a huge difference in the city, especially if we could collect energy, if we could recycle water, collect water and reuse. The other thing that I wanted to say is we've also started to insulate our windows. So there's a product out there, it's very, very cheap. And they're putting it in all the JP Morgan Chase buildings. It actually slides into right in front of our window panels and gives us a 10-degree difference, hot or cold, depending upon the season. We decided to do this not to be ecologically friendly, even though we are, but to kind of get ahead of the curve with regard to, hotter summers and increasing costs. Another thing that we've done proactively, and we did it this year, is we put an extensive sump pump system in our basement because I know this is going to get worse. There are things that business owners and residents can do to start moving in that direction. Unfortunately, most of commerce is not going to do anything until it's either too late or it's right on their doorstep. And so I think, my humble opinion, the move is to kind of get the word out there, get people thinking in this direction, and have people innovate products that could be put in on the kind of low budget basis while having the city and state kind of address the more sweeping issues. What we saw in the subway systems is so very clearly a drainage problem. Green spaces, I think, increase the quality of life, not only in the city, but especially Roosevelt Island, which is why I love Roosevelt Island so much. But it could be done functionally, where people are going to start complaining that the cost is overbearing and dragging their kind of existence down. 10 years ago, nobody wanted to hear about any of this. If you spoke about it, it was pretty unpopular. I think right now, some of the most interesting and most essential technologies are going to be by way of how to protect ourselves against, these kind of once a decade floods that are happening now, once every 2 or 3 years. So I just wanted to give my 2 cents on that and maybe provide some feedback as to what, street level guys like me are doing.
Any comments?
Yeah, sorry, I was trying to unmute. I think you're listing in the bigger picture or trying to take a step back. I think someone, unfortunately, Cecil Corbin-Mark, who passed away, who worked with WeAct for many years, you may have heard his name. We talk about community science knowledge and that communities know a lot about the places where they live. And that's in New York, it's hard to get this information translated. I mean, even when you try to talk about climate or any piece of this problem, it's hard to thread all these pieces together, but it seems like everyone on this call has different pieces of useful information, and it's not clear how to keep those lessons learned and cultivate them and get them to the council and make sure, if we can pay for these kinds of repairs, if we can incentivize them better, if they're being missed, if they're not winding up in the legislation. I don't know what the answer to all of this is, but there's clearly like a lot of embedded knowledge here that's hard for me as an outsider to research. I can spend all day in front of my computer and I would miss this information. And it seems like it's coming from the bottom up. So I don't know if there are long-term ideas from this, but ways that we can capture this and make sure that, restaurants on the Upper East Side can also relay this information to restaurants in the Rockaways or whatever is needed. But it's sort of all swelling up and it's not being threaded or kind of presented in a way that I think is easy for actual people who could benefit from it to get to it. So I'll just put that out there.
Can I just ask, John, do you think that yours is an Upper East Side suggestion? I want to know about the installation that you're talking about, for instance, but so many of your suggestions, is it specific? The one drain that may be too small, but I bet that's true in a lot of buildings. Do you think so, Nancy, that it's This doesn't sound specific to 86th Street and York Avenue.
No, it's probably not. I mean, I'm just sort of guessing. You know, there's always, it's not specific, but I guess if you own your restaurant, you have an ability to change things in a way that if you're in a building, you don't have the ability to make those changes. The one thing I am been sort of somewhat related to this, but sort of separately in my own path, is there's a lot of information out there in the world. And sometimes we're trying to patch it on to specific situations. So like, you know, we've mentioned, we know things are happening worldwide, and the city sometimes tries to take that information in and use it. And I think personally, and Professor Slucky can tell me if I'm wrong, there are a lot of grants, I think, to study things that are specific to neighborhoods or specific to New York City, but the city isn't as proactive at being able to respond to them, to bring in the money, do the work, partner with the university so that we get really knowledge that is tailored to New York City, and even, you know, tailored to Roosevelt Island or tailored to all these situations that we have. I just see oftentimes the city going, oh, we can't apply for this thing. Oh, composting, we don't have the staff right now to make this grant happen. But there are things that would let us answer questions that are really now tailored to us, not just sort of a patchwork of information that we try to use in a building, but was really a building designed for a desert or different kind of conditions. So I don't know if that's useful or not, but I think it's always a problem of governments and people and communities, but somehow, because climate is such a unique problem, we need to kind of shore up and streamline how we all work together and how we all share information. And that's just a big aspirational goal, but I think one that is starting to become a louder message.
So let me just quickly answer her question. So, you know, it's stacked kind of in an order of magnitude. You're going to have some things that individuals or individual business owners will never be able to afford to do. And specifically, the example I brought up was the drain systems not being designed to deal with that type of influx of water. However, I think so much of this is not really going to be coming from universities or from the state or from the government. It's going to be a reaction or response from the people who live in communities. And so, you know, it is our responsibility to a degree to protect our communities. And so, you know, making small purchases, you know, investing in something like a sump pump. Many of the supers closer to East End Avenue were completely flooded out, whereas I wasn't. So the water effectively passed through my building into theirs. And so, you know, it's kind of a roll of the dice. What I am saying, though, is, you know, we are going to have to do something, and we can't afford to wait for the city or the state to jump in and help us out here. And studies are very helpful, but typically they help us look at things more clearly in hindsight, not deal with things that are kind of coming in front of us. And so, you know, Community Board 8 and the myriad of different, challenges that every neighborhood is going to face as a result of climate change and as a result of flooding are going to have to kind of address them individually, but together. You know, the things that I put in the windows, this is something that's being done throughout the city, you know, to kind of retrofit older buildings and make it more cost effective and more environmentally friendly. But you know, the future is very uncertain. We really don't know how people are going to respond to it. But those who don't start to think about it are going to suffer the consequences, you know, next hurricane season when we get another flood. And so, you know, I think it's very important that the work that you and the professor are doing is, you know, put into the communities or disseminated through community boards, and we start to act based on the information you're giving us. But there's no doubt in my mind that we're going to suffer through some more circumstances that are going to be less than desirable.
True.
So, John, thank you. The professor has to leave pretty soon at 8, so maybe we're going to do rapid fire questions from the next 3 people who have their hands up.
Who's next? Trish.
Trish, but Teddy is a little upset. Do you want me to skip and go to Craig? Okay.
Okay, Craig later, as in D, not T.
I'll take either. I want to thank both of the speakers. I want to thank the chairs of the committee. I want to thank Russell for all helping to organize this. I know he reached out to promote.
Yes, we want to thank you too.
And I'm so glad that we're having this discussion tonight. So I know we're short on time, so a few immediate questions, and I could come back to others. Does the city have a current master plan for climate change?
Well, they have variations of what they would describe as plans. So, under the Bloomberg administration, they had the Plan NYC, which they, presented as a broad spectrum kind of set of policies around sustainability, some of which was climate. Then, post Sandy, there was the kind of the rebuild sort of plan. So that was seen as very much a focused effort on adaptation. And then there's one NYC, which has elements of an adaptation plan as well. If I could critique, New York City as a government has been very aggressive in the space for a long time and is really a global leader. That being said, they have, and I think Dr. Holt was kind of referring to this as well. It's like they've had a kind of a scattergun shot approach. They have like series of studies. It's hard to sort of put them all together, and I don't think they've really, in recent years, been able to sort of thread all these sorts of things. Just as a simple example, the heat as a topic of focus is separate from other aspects of climate change, but really those need to be more thoroughly integrated. Some of that's happening. I'm sorry, that's a long answer, but it's sort of like it's a disparate set of activities, and they're trying to sort of put them together. But from my perspective, I don't think it's a fully coherent presentation.
A new study came out today. It was on, and I haven't read every bit of it, but 9/10 of it is just, how to get people out of the basements and how do we shut down, more of.
You're referencing the IDA report?
I'm sorry?
The IDA report that just came out?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's an example. Again, I've worked with the city a lot. They're friends, blah, blah, blah. But that was a really quick kind of compilation of stuff that
I'm not talking about what we could do to mitigate the situation, more of when there's this emergency, how do we prevent deaths maybe, rather than saying that we have this problem and this flooding.
It sounds like there are two different issues at hand here. We've spoken a lot, and there have been a lot of great ideas exchanged about actions that individuals or property owners or business owners can take to shore things up and make improvements that collectively over the longer term can have some significant benefits. But at least I'm viewing this as there are three real overarching issues when it comes to climate change: addressing extreme heat, extreme rainfall, and extreme tidal events.
And wind. We haven't mentioned wind. Wind was a major issue with this, with Ida and Sandy.
That is true as well. So I guess where I'm going with this is in terms of what can we do as a near-term action? Would it be helpful to start to promote the idea that we need to now pull everything together and actually have a master plan for dealing with climate change and resiliency, where we can lay out specifically what are the different components of climate change, and what is the existing conditions of each of the critical elements of infrastructure or land that will impact our ability to actually make improvements, whether it be stormwater drainage capacity or the need for flood mitigation or flood prevention, whatever it may be, and then coming up with a funding plan and action plan to be able to develop whether it be different grants or just a inventory of all the improvements that are necessary and how to prioritize them in a way that we could address things as best as possible in the short term and then over the longer term.
Thank you, Craig.
Is that something that we should be aiming to do as a city? I guess that's my broader question here.
I think that's definitely a topic of conversation with this Intro 1620 that's sitting, and Costa Constantinides, who left the council, was a big proponent of climate change, and it's called calling for a 5-borough-wide resiliency plan. I don't know if it's details or sort of strategic plan. I don't know if it's details, but I think the question I have, just seeing that in Legistar, you can look it up in the council, is what's the resolution? Northern Queens is very different than Southern Queens. Northern Manhattan and Lower Manhattan are very different. So at what level do we really get to where people can act on that information, or it becomes sort of a borough-wide washout and you kind of average out the interesting details that you'd miss.
Dr. Nancy, would you be able to stay another few minutes? I'm sorry.
Yeah, I can stay another few minutes.
Yeah, I can stay. You know, I also wrote to Will. I could say a few minutes. I wrote my email or my text a little bit wrong. I said I could a few minutes after 8, but I need to.
Okay.
Calls, but you know, I want to pick up the point that was just raised about, and we've talked about it many times already tonight. You know, about the role of context and look site specific. We heard some great details on Roosevelt Island and what's going on out there. I mean, that's just really rich detail that is just generally not available, you know, writ large across multiple neighborhoods. And, you know, I think, you know, maybe through the community board process, I mean, there could be that like exchange. I know Nancy mentioned sort of the knowledge exchange and all this kind of stuff. I mean, I think we're spinning up to get that level of inter-neighborhood, inter-community exchange of lessons learned, but it's a slow process, and I think there are some mechanisms to accelerate it. That being said, you know, the notion of actionable knowledge, right, is a big question mark in this whole discussion. Like, you know, because to really, I mean, from the work I do, generally looks at the city writ large and provides sort of that broader input. That being said, to sort of burrow into a specific project, you know, requires, as you all know, I'm sure, in terms of engineering, you know, specs, write-ups, detailed evaluations. I mean, it's tens of thousands of dollars just to start the question, let alone to really spec something out. You know, it's usually hundreds of thousands of dollars to really sort of figure out how to do something like a, you know, a barrier or whatever, regardless of building. So the problem is often the case that you can have the general information, but getting like actionable data that's specific to community is just really hard. And I think one of the sources, which, you know, Dr. Holt's kind of working on here, is to sort of create that mechanism of cross-community kind of collaboration and to sort of, you know, circumvent some of these limits and get stuff, knowledge on the ground quicker from what's going on in other contexts. I think that's a real plus.
Will, are there other people? If not, I would love to.
Yeah, Trisha, and then we have a person from the public named Rebecca.
Okay.
So thank you so much. It's really, I thought the presentations were wonderful and the conversation was really good. A couple points and a question. So again, just to add some of that granular knowledge, I co-chair the Parks and Waterfront Committee. We oversee the Esplanade and have just anecdotally seen that as we've worked on the repairs to the Esplanade since 2011, we've seen that our infrastructure is crumbling at a faster rate than anticipated. Every single weak point that has been pointed out along the waterfront has collapsed sooner than we expected it to, and that's based on plans that the city has put out, based on our engineers' reports. Every single time we see collapse happen faster. And a lot of that we hear is because of the water rise. We hear it's because of increased usage. We hear because the water is actually getting cleaner. We see more microbes in the water that are eating away faster at the wooden pillars below. But if to add more of that granular knowledge, I think that's why it affects, and you've heard it affects businesses, it affects transportation, of course, it affects housing or seniors, and so many other places. Nancy, you know me, and you know that I've been a bit of a geek when it comes to our sewers. So I think the question to you and to Bill that I have for you is just to talk a little bit more about that, about what your recommendations would be for the city to better handle how we deal with our water. I think that so much of what John was talking about and so much of our issues with again, the East River really concern me with those CSOs and concern me with our ability just to react and respond to these increased heavy rainfall. And I think that goes back to our water treatment centers and our water tanks and what we can do there. So if you can just talk a little bit about that, it's something that's near and dear to me. And I will just say that the statistics that always stands out to me is that if it rains more than a tenth of an inch of water, we are pumping raw sewage into one of our waterways in the city. So anytime it rains more than a tenth of an inch of water, know that one of our major waterways is getting raw sewage, which is just unbelievable in 2021. And then finally, I just wanted to say to Craig's point, which was my point, I think that for this committee and for Barbara and Kaz, I would make this recommendation. I think it's really interesting to think about working collectively and intersectionally across other committees with you guys leading it to create a plan or an aspirational idea document that really identifies the gray, green, and blue infrastructure pieces that we know would help make our community more resilient. So I think that can't be done just with your committee alone. I think that it does intersect all these different issues. Housing, we don't even have our housing people here tonight, but that also health and seniors, all of these things. But I think that, to Craig's point, it would be really great to see us meet not every time a storm happens, but to see us proactively meet throughout, say, the next year to talk about these issues and put pen to paper and really come up with something that has to do with land use and has to do with all these other things, so that we, at the end of the year, have a document that really reflects where we want to be as a community. So those are my 3 points: parks, sewers, and plans. And if you guys can talk about that, that'd be great. Thank you.
I mean, I'll just say quickly, I think it would be fantastic, and I don't know how much bandwidth you guys have, to have a community proposed plan and show something that the city could start to model off of. And maybe that's a way to get to meet in between, because it's true. What you see are these really nice sets of data, these really long reports from the city. They're hard to navigate, but there's a lot of really good information in there. But it is sort of disconnected, it is sporadic, and what's really difficult, I think, from the outside to tell, even from the city's capital budgets, is what the progress is on any of those things. It's just hard to know. Really nice plans on paper, what's being done. But I do think if there are a way for you to set a model for other community boards, I think that's kind of what we're trying to do in a way, is not go from the top down, but go from the bottom up. We started at the council district level because that's who came to us and who was interested in understanding what was going in their council district. But if a community board could set a model that other community boards could follow, and maybe that were some way to think about this, I think that would be great. I mean, I think I love that you're a geek. I know that. I know that we've had long conversations about the sewer, I mean, I still think in terms of infrastructure, it's just getting the water out of the sewer is an easier go right now than a long haul repair to the sewers, looking at budgets and all of those things. But there are obviously plans out there to do that. And then there's always the trick of, who owns buildings and how much green space you can implement and how much a community is willing to change things. But maybe Professor Slucky can add more there than I can.
Yeah, not too much. I mean, I was going to say the same thing. I mean, I've been doing this work for 25 years, and my shtick, when I wrote a first report was, the city can sort of integrate, or DEC or DEP could integrate, which has a huge capital budget of like tens of billions of dollars, could integrate, upgrades to sort of deal with some of these things as capital upgrades need to be done. The unfortunate thing, and maybe this is not a good way to, bring it to the very end, the process and the onrush of climate change is more rapid in some ways than, in terms of extreme events, than people had talked about and thought 20 years ago. We're in it. We're in climate change now, and the implications are pretty profound. And that, so I mean, we've kind of overrun the capital budget sort of process. So unless you're talking about like huge dedicated like outlays of funds to redo the plumbing, the sewage, which most places don't have, and even New York, which is deeply pocketed in this way, doesn't have. You're going to be
$100 billion, I think, right? Something like $100 billion, I think.
That sounds about right. Yeah, that sounds probably in the right ballpark. It's at least the right number of zeros. The thing that retention, water retention, like keeping, slowing down these, I think that's what you're talking about, Nancy, in terms of retention, detention, things on roofs, things in the middle of streets, all these kinds of things. that's, potentially if it's done in a way that where we could do it strategically and to do it at specific points where delaying water sort of rushing into drains, et cetera, could work. That takes some kind of modeling as well, but that's right now probably our best option.
So we've got our work cut out.
Okay. So it's a little bit downer. But
if you can make everything Park Avenue, maybe you'll
yes. Yeah.
expand Park Avenue to Madison Avenue.
It's interesting. I did a project once looking at, this is a different context, but up, in East Harlem, there's the old Harlem Creek that sort of used to sort of wind through like 100. If you ever go up Park Avenue or Lexington or whatever, like 106, 107th is like the most low spot. There used to be about an 80-foot creek and 80-foot wide creek in there. They filled in. Now there's ways of potentially retrofitting and creating some water spaces in that neighborhood, but Upper East Side is, cheek by jowl. It's really tight. There's very, very limited opportunities to do that kind of work. They're doing that in, sorry to extend it, but the city has a big cloudburst program that they're doing out in Jamaica and I forgot all the neighborhoods, but again, it sort of mirrors some of the old hydrology in that area going into Jamaica Bay, but it's a land extensive enterprise that's very challenging to do in a highly urbanized place like Upper East Side.
And next you have Rebecca.
Hi, thank you everyone so much. My name is Rebecca Weintraub. I'm the district leader for the 76th Assembly District, Part A, which overlaps entirely with the Community Board 8 area. I actually live on 74th Street, and one of your maps showed that 74th Street of all streets has a flood risk. And I found that really interesting because we're kind of nerds in our household, and we have an 1865 sanitation map on our wall as decoration, which shows just how many underground streams there really are on the Upper East Side and in our neighborhood within our district. One of them runs directly underneath our building. And during the storm a couple of weeks ago, we had it's a 20-story building on a corner. We had multiple inches of water in our basement, which I am under the impression came up through what was once an underground and revealed itself stream into the basement of our building, shutting down 3 elevators in a building filled with an aging population. We only have 3 elevators, so that gives us a little context there. I want to know if there's been any thought. Our neighbor, as I said, there's a map hanging. I can see it right across the room on my wall. Our neighborhood, I think, has some of the largest and probably more than most other neighborhoods, bodies of water underneath what we've built on top of. Have we done any research into what what those waterways, are they growing? Are they still there? Are they the flood risk? Is something else coming? I've never seen water come up the FDR up to 74th Street, but there was clearly significant flooding 2 blocks off the river for us to have 3 inches of water in our basement. So I'm curious if we've looked at those underground waterways at all and if anyone has a plan around them.
I don't know the answer to that, but I think it's completely fascinating because I don't know how it makes me want to go back and look at how the stormwater maps were made, because there is this constant, just like we're talking about with Jamaica Bay and JFK and the AirTran, you basically can see the creeks taking back their lands. And if you look at where the flooding comes, it's where the old, Pearl Street and where we've filled in time. I don't know the answer, like I said, to the study, and I'm sorry that you got flooded, but it is, I feel like we need to go back to the Manhattan project and see where everything is and figure out if that's matching up with the stormwater flooding, if we haven't done that already.
It's a great question. And, I've been, there's some focus on daylighting streams and so forth. And, other cities have done this to reveal, Yonkers has done this, I forgot the name of the river. I guess it was not the Yonkers River, maybe the
Bronx River?
Which one?
The Bronx River?
No, I think it was a Sawmill, maybe. It's the one that goes through downtown Yonkers. They sort of exposed it. It was put in a big culvert. But again, specific to your question, I mean, that's the exact question that I had as well, because if you look throughout the city, there are these, the city was crisscrossed with these little streams and rivulets and so forth in Manhattan, but also Bronx and every borough. It's a kind of a research question, but also a policy question to sort of see how that mirrors with some of the extensive flooding. My gut is that it's probably going to mirror pretty well. I think in most cases, these streams kind of were obliterated. In some cases, they were put into culverts. Like the Harlem Creek I mentioned was put into a big culvert. There's a huge, like 10-foot, brick culvert that it was put into. And that culvert was actually bisected by a sewage drain as well. So it's who knows where the water goes. So that's a specific case. So I think you'd need to go case by case and see what happened to these streams. But certainly what you also could say is that those sites are low elevation sites, where there was a stream because there was a low elevation. And so as a result, there's more potential for flooding. But with that, I'll probably have to go away very, very soon. But I will commit. I know, Barbara, you're probably going to, be chagrined that I'm going to leave. But I'm just teasing you. But
we do have more questions. But we thank you so much for coming. I just would like to know that when we do get, and Russell, you'll tell me if this is okay. When the two of us, when we do write up the minutes, and we'll try to be as detailed with some of the suggestions that John, and Roosevelt Island and so on did. Would it be helpful if you got our minutes just to review some of the ideas? Sure. Great. Sure. We can't thank you enough.
No, it's been fun. It's been rewarding. Thanks for the invite. And also as an institutional, as an institutional neighbor, no, but I'd be willing to help as you guys sort of do your continued planning. I don't live in the neighborhood, but I'm close enough, often enough that it's right. I feel part of it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, Barbara, one other point. If anybody is interested in contributing to any information, if they can send an email to Will, we can collect all the people that are interested in sharing their knowledge, their information, and we can pass it on to Bill and Nancy. And that'll be the start of our future endeavor.
Is it time for me to say something, or are there other people, Will, that you would want?
No, nobody else has their hand up.
Okay.
I'm going to step away. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much. I may call on you if we need some information, but thank you so much. I've been thinking about this for really since post-IT, but certainly for the couple of weeks that we planned this meeting. And I try to think of it in terms of practicality, in terms of money. So redoing the sewers for $100 billion just doesn't sound like something that's going to be done tomorrow. There's certain issues as green space we're hearing, but there's some sort of special green space. And maybe that's something we can do with the Parks Committee, Tricia, for instance, have some sort of joint meeting that talks about how green space. I will say that Lynn is a wonderful guide around Roosevelt Island, and she was my guide. They have an over amount of green space. And when they do build the 4 acres, I wonder if there's a way that maybe they could build it slightly differently to make it more porous or something like that. In terms of sidewalks, I do remember many years ago, Central Park Conservancy came to us. We were doing, I think it was Bethesda Plaza, and they have a new material that is great. I've walked on it. It's great that they purposely put down to be porous to collect water. I wonder if we could start talking about expanding it. I don't know which committee, expanding this. So we say, anytime you redo your sidewalk, you can't not use this cement, you have to use a different type of cement that would be more porous and collect the water. I mean, John's idea of something that he said isn't terribly expensive, maybe even for apartment buildings to have some things that will lower the temperature or raise the temperature by 10 degrees look how much air conditioning we can save if we do that. And these all sound like practical areas. And so I think the idea of getting together with other committees with the help of our chair that may say which committee is the right one to go to would be a great idea. Do you agree, Kaz? That would be
definitely. I mean, Trish had
a
good points. Yes.
Right. But we also have the land use, whether it be land use and zoning. I think transportation would probably be able to help with some information. I mean, it's just an overwhelming problem, but I really think that we could start small, and small makes some difference. Wendy and Andrew that talked about the height limits, we've been talking about this for years and fighting for years. Our community board is on board for a lower height limit. What will happen, we don't know, but certainly we want to do that. So I found this a difficult committee in the sense that it's just overwhelming. I wish we had a 2-cent answer to give, but I don't think we do at this point, right, Nancy?
Yeah, I mean, I think every time I try to think about presenting this, it is overwhelming, and I was just trying to almost organize it in some way, because that's kind of like the first step in how I can talk about things. So I was trying to give like a framework for at least like, here's where we start. It was sort of encouraged, unfortunately, in a negative way, right, by Professor Selecki, kind of reaffirming that we don't have a ton of solutions. So I always feel like sometimes I've missed things are out there. I think, though, the important part is what I'm hearing from you guys is there is so much information that just I can't look at from the outside. I can't synthesize unless I speak to you. And even if getting all the information together isn't like completely feasible, it's almost like, let's at least set up, this is how my brain works, like let's set up the template of what we hope to fill in, you know, what are the areas we need to look at, like what would a report look like eventually, and then, you know, sort of timeline. But I do think I kind of live for like, how do communities fit into this very big problem? And I think hearing that there's all this information that I missed is almost oddly encouraging, because it's like we need to start pushing the city from the other end as well, in order to really like tailor its plans and translate that information.
I thought we would come out with a resolution that said we need more money for XYZ, but I don't.
Yes, and that we'll put that right up front.
Right.
We all need
Nancy, I hope we can be, you know, a contributor to you. I hope we will be able to do that.
I believe you already have been tonight, so I have lots of notes.
Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you for having me.
Right.
Nice meeting you all.
Any other comments?
Thanks, Nancy. Thanks, Barbara. Thanks, everybody.
Russell, do you want to say anything, Russell, or is there anything?
I just want to thank everybody for being here, and yeah, thank Nancy and Bill. This was a really good meeting, and it's given us a lot to think about. I think there's going to be a lot more work to do in this and other committees. That's really all I have to say, but thank you, everybody.
Great.
Thank you. And I think you can get my email from Barbara if you need it, or if you just want to communicate through Barbara, or if you have other questions after this.
We'll do it, but we can be in contact, and we'll send the, we'll work on the minutes. It may take a while. And
we'll e-blast your email, Nancy.
Right.
Sounds good. I'm here. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Thank you all.
Motion to adjourn.
Great.
Motion to adjourn. Yes. Thanks, Will.
Second.
Thank you, everybody. Okay. Bye-bye.